Hello everyone, today I'm going to be doing a review on Apoxie Sculpt, both just talking about the product, showing how it mixes and talking a little bit about the properties, as well as doing a bit of a test with the product for my purposes, so you can see just some different characteristics of Apoxie Sculpt. Primarily what I use epoxy, or I should say I use clays and modeling compounds for are things for the small scale modeling, miniature terrain and miniature sort of hobby for wargaming. You may or may not actually be looking into this for that purpose, but just to give you some context, that's sort of where I'm coming from when wanting to use it. And so it's mainly for modeling, and it is listed as a modeling compound on here, although I've seen a number of folks use it for making costumes on YouTube for cosplay and like sculpture and other things as well. Purpose that I'm using Apoxie Sculpt and looking into it is that I've used other products in the past like Green Stuff and Milliput, and they come in fairly small quantities and are quite pricey as compared to Apoxie Sculpt. And for when using this for larger projects, I wanted a similar type of product but at a more affordable sort of price. Your prices are going to really vary widely depending on where you are and when you're looking for this. But just to give you an example, this is 4 pounds of Apoxie Sculpt. It comes in 1 pound and much less smaller quantities as well. Something like this you can get for about 45 Canadian if you look, if you look for it at a good price. And Green Stuff you're going to get, in many cases for Knead-A-Tite or Green Stuff you're going to get like 2 tubes, maybe each of this length, which is really going to be, I don't know, 1/10 the size of one of these perhaps, for about half that price and maybe a quarter of that price. So it is much cheaper. We'll see after the review, if it actually is worthwhile in trying to get this product instead. Just to mention a couple properties, it seems to have a lot of the similar properties of 2-part epoxies, but you need to measure equal parts. They recommend that you use a separate tool for each one when pulling the product out, because it starts to cure and react, once each one's touching each other. If you put some of one or the other in there, it's going to degrade slightly some of the product in that container. They recommend mixing and kneading the product for 2 minutes until combined and a uniform color is achieved. Then they say that you can let it rest for 5 minutes to give it a good working time. I've heard 15 minutes, and I guess I'm probably going to go with 15, even though the product recommends 5 setting before working with it. Then you have a working time, they say, of 1 to 3 hours, and there's a full cure in 24 hours of the product, and it's apparently a hard, glossy finish. Now, I guess a couple of things that I will test in this, I'm going to be doing, after I mix this together, I'm going to be doing some stone wall sections that I'm going to be sculpting. I'm going to do 3 or 4 of them. And then I'm going to sort of work with them at 15 minutes and then at various increments out to 3 hours, just to get a feel for how it works and when the best working time is for when I engage in a bigger project. So I will show that as well. A couple of the things that when working with oven-baked clays and other kinds of clay, like drying clay, self-dry clays, air dry, as well as 2-part epoxies like this, people are concerned about the ability to sand and to carve and to do other things with it too. I'm going to try to get a bit of a sense of that as well. I will try to carve a little bit and sand a little bit of the final product, just to see after the 24-hour cure what that looks like and how it compares. So I will now open these up and mix out 2 parts. Before I mix these together, one thing I'll just notice is it does come in different colors. I ended up purchasing the white. Now, this looks very gray to me. This is definitely white. It came sealed in a package that said white. I don't know after mixing this how light it will be. I kind of expected them both to be a bit lighter in color because of that. It's not much of an issue for me, but we'll just see afterwards how it looks. So now I'll just mix it for a couple of minutes. Okay, so we've mixed this for 2 minutes. One thing I just wanted to mention too is it does say that it can be wetted, and it mentions in the product information that water, but they also talk about this company is made by Aves, and they have a safety solvent which can also be used. Now, I have seen some user commentary occasionally that they much prefer the safety solvent to water. I don't have the safety solvent today, so at some points I may wet it with water, but it can be, according to the product, cleaned up with water as well. So I'll provide more commentary on that later, and I'm going to let this set for 15 minutes. Be right back. Okay, so it's been 15 minutes. As you can see, it did actually lighten up quite a bit. I guess the white color, or that part A, is fairly dominant in its coloring of the product. It looks very white to me. One thing I failed to mention earlier, though, that I want to mention is that I am wearing plastic gloves. They do recommend that you don't actually use your skin with the product. As well, though, I'm also using the gloves see a benefit that you don't want to get as many fingerprints when you're working with the product too, and so they do say you can use some water to smooth out, or their solvent to fingerprints and things like that. But that's the, I recommend that you use gloves as well. So now I'm going to put this into, I guess, 4 or 5 different sections. I'm going to use just a piece of MDF board to create a stone finish, and I'll start at the 15-minute mark just doing some sculpting detail, and I'll be back after I've done all of these actually, and just to talk about the workability on each one. Okay. Hey everyone, so I'm back now after 3 hours of working with the Apoxie Sculpt. I essentially did 5 sort of tests, but this first one and this last one here were done both at 15 minutes of letting it sit. And then I meant to do some additional sort of special effects on this one, but I accidentally did it on the first one here. So I'm just gonna, we can look at this one just without the special effects as far as how it ends up looking. So when first mixing with it, when I was mixing it in front of everyone, it actually is extremely soft as compared to something like green stuff. Like, it feels very much like a clay versus a 2-part epoxy if your comparison is Kneadatite. It also has a bit of a feel like milliput, where when you push it all together, if you were to rip it or if it tears in places, it forms a crack where you can see a pulling away. Whereas green stuff, I don't typically notice that. It's sort of fairly uniform. It'll stretch before it will rip. But the other thing I noticed is that using a little bit of water, because it's extremely sticky at first, even after the 15 minutes of setting, and well, it's fairly sticky, and it's still very workable, but by using a little bit of water just to moisten it slightly and to moisten your tools, it makes it much less sticky and much easier to work with. So I didn't find any problems with moistening it with water. I know I've heard some people online have had issues. I didn't have any issues. I'll continue to use water. There was no issues whatsoever. Yeah, and so from that perspective, I think it actually worked really well. It also smooths very nicely. Just with, if you're using a glove or like a flat surface, you can smooth it very nicely with a little bit of water. So with 15 minutes, it was really, really soft. It's like working with what you would think of as like a school clay. And so in some ways, if you're looking for a little bit of resistance in your sculpting, that could be difficult at times. You might be, when you press, getting a lot less give than what you want. But I still felt it was fairly workable at that time period. I ended up using a credit card. This is an old credit card from like 15 years ago that I just had in a bin, and I used that to make my initial lines, and then I used sculpting tools to create the individual lines and some more details around the edges and some indentations just to create some rougher exterior. So I thought it worked pretty good. When going to the 1 hour mark, it was noticeably stiffer. And in some ways, I would much prefer the 1 hour mark at the curing time for this kind of detail and putting this kind of detail in than at the 15-minute mark. Now, having said that, I think if you were to start at 15 minutes and gradually work through to the first hour, I think you could still replicate the same results. I don't think it's going to be drastically different. And so that might be important. But I would say the feeling for me was much better. There was definitely a little bit of a resistance to the sculpting tool, slightly, that I preferred. 2 hours was definitely stiffer again, but probably still very workable and a period that I would work with. I would probably prefer the hour and the 2 hour mark to the 15 minutes if you're trying to go for details that you don't want to, I guess, to have too much softness for. And then the 3 hour mark was very, very stiff. And to give you an example, the sculpting tool I had no problem with because you're using such a small surface area with your force that it sculpted the detail in pretty well. But when I tried to use the actual credit card to make the initial lines, I really had to press hard down, and it warped the card a little bit as I was doing it. And so I do think 3 hour mark is sort of maximum for me, and I probably would be looking to be done before that point, depending on the kind of sculpting that I want to do. Lastly, I would just say for this sort of work, I wanted to do a bit of a test because I think likely for the purposes that I want to do, I would rather have a rougher exterior. I'm looking to do like an old stone structure, and so what I wanted to try to create that effect. And so what I did with this is I did all the sculpting at 15 minutes, like I said. This was meant to be the 15-minute trial. And I was meant to do the finishing work touches down here. What I ended up doing is experimenting and just rolling up a really, really tight ball of foil and then sort of lightly running it over it, and this was at the hour mark, and I found that it accepted that really well. So you take that for what it is. It's not a tool pressing down into it, so it's just lightly rolling on it, and that's at the hour mark where that last piece happened, and I think it actually looked quite good, and I think I probably will try to incorporate that into my project that I end up doing. So lastly, I'll just come back in greater than 24 hours and just try to sand and carve a bit. And then as well, because one of the reasons why I initially wanted to go with an epoxy for this project is I noticed with some of the air dry clays and some of the clays in general that sometimes they can crack, and they didn't seem to be as tough and sturdy as these more synthetic two-part epoxies like Kneadatite. And so what I'm probably going to do is take maybe the edge of a hammer and not, wail at it, but I'm going to probably try to take a good swing, like good tap at this with a fine edge, just to simulate it bumping into something and seeing how tough it is, because I really want this to be sturdy so it won't break when I'm using it in a project. Like for things that you would use in miniature wargaming where you have them on the table and they could be bumping into things, they're being taken in and out of boxes, things like that. Okay, be back in about 24 hours. Hey everyone, so I am back, and I'm actually 24 hours after the initial mixing of the Apoxie Sculpt. So I have a few little tests I'm going to do right in front of you. Just to let you know, it's got a really nice, hard, tacky sort of feel to it. I would say it definitely feels like a two-part epoxy. It doesn't feel like a clay, which is nice. It has a feeling of like a very durable finish, which is sort of what I'm looking for. One thing I did notice is that I didn't speak about when having just finished the 3 hour is the 3 hour the detail does look a bit softer to me, and now that may just be because it was a harder material at that point. Yeah, I actually did have to apply pressure, so the slightest movements when doing my sculpting really didn't get picked up as well. I think if you look at it here, you can see that the detail is definitely softer. So when you hit that 3 hour mark where they say, that's when you should be finished, doing your work, you can do some things, but I see why that instruction's given, because it's definitely clearly different looking here as compared to there, and I did the same method. These two are still fairly close. So that's just a heads up. First up, I'm going to try to carve a little bit into this piece here to see how well it responds to carving, you know, if you needed to carve some out of this. I'm just going to take a sharp sculpting tool. Now this is actually fairly sharp. And you can, as you can see, it can be carved actually fairly easily. If I actually kind of go like this, just keep working on it, what you can see here is I was able to carve this sort of flat surface into that. So it carves nicely without fracturing. So that test is kind of nice. I'm going to inscribe a little bit into it, or just use a razor knife. Just I'm assuming that this will be able to cut into this. And it can. So with a razor knife, I was able to cut that line into it. And it doesn't fracture. It does have like resistance in the other areas around it. It literally just takes the cut. I was going to as well try sanding a little bit. See how best to do this, but I guess I'll just see how. I have a piece of 120 grit sandpaper, and I'm just going to take some and we'll just see if it rubs onto the paper on the bottom. It sands really well. Actually, as you can see already, sands very well. So you can sand this really nicely. And then lastly, I wanted to get an idea how durable it was. Now I said, I think in the beginning of the video I was going to use a hammer, but what I've just grabbed is I just grabbed a sort of heavy-duty set of pliers here with an edge, and I just want to see, with something like this, I'm not hitting hard, but it's enough that if it was clay, and many types of clay, it would just fracture and break. So I just want to get an idea. See? It's very durable, which is really a very important one for me for the purposes of making terrain and things. I want something that I make to be able to withstand jarring and bumping around and other objects hitting it and stuff, and I think this will be fine. So, I hope that you enjoyed this review and testing of the Apoxie Sculpt for sculpture. I should say just sort of modeling and detail sculpture here, and some of the tests that I did of it as a material compared to other two-part epoxies and clays. And if you like the video, please like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks very much. Bye.